Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Calderon-Muñiz.
Welcome to yet another episode of your favorite podcast. There's no other way to describe the Jack Westin MCAT podcast. I don't know about you, Phil, but it's my favorite podcast.
My favorite.
Today, we're going to give you another reason to love this podcast. We're going to be talking about one thing that, yes, you can get tested on, but that is so relevant for what you're doing now. It's relevant for undergrad, for studying for the MCAT, for med school, for your future. And that's memory. And today we're going to be chatting about not just how we think about things, but how to actually apply what we know about memory to make your studying useful.
Yeah, I love that. This is going to be practical. But we're not going to be just talking about memory overall, but we're going to be talking about different techniques to utilize memory and to get stuff to stick better, stuff that's been verified experimentally. This is a better way to learn something. And at the very end of this, we kind of have a special announcement that we're pretty excited about. I'm really excited about it. It's something that we've been working on here at Jack Westin for over a year, kind of behind the scenes. One of the big things that we are launching that should be out by the time you hear this podcast, there's going to be some new stuff going on. And so we're going to be talking about that as well. And that does pertain to everything that we're talking about here.
Yeah, I'm super excited as well. I think the fact that so much time and effort has been put into this is a testament to how much we value you guys here at Jack Westin, how much we care about your success. So backing up, we're backing up into memory, right? And let's think about, okay, how do we learn, right? I don't know about you guys, but I can sit down and I can study for 2 hours, and if I don't see it again, I will forget it. And so one of the things that I have learned in med school is that if I do the homework on Saturday for a class that's on Tuesday, I'm not going to remember what I read. I'm not going to remember the answers I chose in the quiz, and I'm going to have a hard time participating in class. So I'll usually do it Sunday instead of Saturday. It's a little bit closer, right? And do a quick review before heading into class. And this gets at the idea that when we learn something, we're inclined to forget it. We're inclined to forget more of it the more time goes on. And so there was this scientist, Hermann Ebbinghaus, who studied this idea of forgetting. So how did he study this idea of forgetting? When I learned this, I was just like, that's boss. So instead of recruiting a bunch of other people to do this, Ebbinghaus looked at nonsensical syllables, 3 syllables at a time, 2,300, and determined, okay, what happens when I'm trying to learn these nonsense syllables? And what would happen was, yes, when he reviewed them at the very beginning, right, he remembered, but as time went on, he forgot them. But if he reviewed them again, not super far out, then he'd remember more, and he was less likely to forget kind of to that same base level as though he'd never reviewed it. And so each time that you review something, yes, you'll still have some forgetting, but you'll remember more than the first time that you studied it. And then the more you review it, the longer you can go between the times that you're reviewing. So this curve of forgetting points to the usefulness, the utility of spaced repetition, right? I see it once, I can't go too long, right, before I forget most of it. I see it again, I'm going to remember more, see it again, going to remember more. And so this is useful when you're studying in general and also for the MCAT, because MCAT, right, mile wide, inch deep sometimes. And so when you go too long without reviewing something, it can be really tough to remember. But if you throw in some review of material you've already learned into this broader picture, into your MCAT, journey and study schedule, you're going to have a better chance of remembering. And then as you, cement that, learning and understanding and applying.
Yeah. So just to talk about the curve a little bit more, because you might get this tested actual on your MCAT. This is something spaced repetition, spaced learning is something that the MCAT will hold you accountable for. But the idea here is if you just view this once and then never again, you see a sharper drop at the beginning. Like you forget the most in the first like couple of days. So if you studied like a whole bunch over the weekend, 2 or 3 days in, you may only remember like 20% of what stuff you covered then. But if you review it again that day, you can then fast forward 3 days, now you remember like 40%. And you review it again, and the curve drops, but it never goes as far down as it was before in terms of how much you remember. And so if you review this like 3 or 4 times, but you keep spacing it out, eventually your baseline, like the amount that it will drop down to, will be like 80%. Like you're going to remember 80% of this stuff, like long term, forever. And this is one of the things. This is why we talk about, this factors into studying, right? Like you shouldn't be cramming for things, because like when you cram, you just like cover a lot of stuff, and then if you don't look at it again, you don't cover it again, like you're only going to remember like 20% of that. I really wish forgetting wasn't a thing. Like that would be an awesome superpower, to just be able to read something once and remember it forever. I don't know about you, Azaii. That would have made my life so much easier. But this spaced repetition, this Ebbinghaus curve of forgetting, is something that shows up a lot, and it's why you do homework, right? It's why you do quizzes. It's why you do practice questions, right? You can't just study for the MCAT, sit down, like read all the chapters, and then just like, okay, I'm done, I'm ready to go take the MCAT, because you're not going to remember it. So kind of an interesting thing overall. I think about it way more often than I probably should. I feel like I think about it like on a daily basis, and it's just because I'm teaching, and I'm like, okay, how can I bring in stuff that we talked about before?
Listen, I've also been thinking about it a lot recently. Like we were just having a conversation about this. I feel like I forget things super quick. So you had just told me something, and I wrote something else down, and I was like, wait, what'd you say? But now I can remember what you said because you repeated it to me. Mm-hmm. And so even though I had that super big drop off at the very beginning, now that I've reviewed it, right, you just mentioned it again, then I'm more likely to remember it. And watch, I'll probably remember, later today, because I reviewed it essentially again. But if you're someone like me that you have a tendency to forget very quickly, this is also something you can do on the go, right? You don't have to be sitting in front of a computer to review things. And a lot of times that's what we picture studying as, just because it's what we're used to, right? For undergrad and studying for the MCAT, and it feels like everything is virtual, right? But you can also, you're on the bus, you can think about what you've, been studying, and ask yourself, okay, what was XYZ? What was the curve of forgetting, right? And so there are so many forms that studying can take, and that this spaced repetition can also take. And so like you mentioned, Phil, we can do quizzes, we can do homework, but even something as simple as when you're on a walk, just think about what you've been studying.
Yeah, that's something, like the stuff that I remember most is the stuff that I think about the most, for sure. And so there'll be times when I'll think about like, the personality disorders, because I hear about something happening with some celebrity. I'm like, that person's got this personality disorder. Or as I'm walking and I see like a river and I'm thinking about fluid dynamics, I realize I am probably alone in that. But like thinking about stuff kind of like reinforces it, which is big. Now, so there's this like spaced repetition and the Ebbinghaus curve of forgetting, but I also want to talk about the testing effect. And so the testing effect is this idea that quizzing yourself is better than just pure studying. Like if you have 20 minutes, you could study for all 20 minutes, or you could study for 10 minutes and then quiz yourself for 10 minutes. And it turns out that second scenario, studying for 10 and quizzing for 10, is better for retention. You will remember things better long term if you are quizzing yourself. I know I've talked about this before, but like when I first went to med school, I was not doing this. I was just being a passive learner. I was just reading the chapters, rereading the chapters, watching the lectures, rewatching the lectures, reading someone else's notes. I wasn't doing anything where I was kind of quizzing myself. I was just constantly trying to study and take in information and not test myself. And that really hurt I struggled that first semester until I figured out like, oh, I need to change the way I'm dealing with this. I need to be quizzing myself. I need to be creating diagrams and charts and figures and something much more active. And so I'll like create a chart, and now I have to go in and fill it all in. And I'm like quizzing myself trying to do that. And that's a way better way to learn that. This is also why it's important, once again, to take practice tests, why it's important to do like QBank stuff, quiz yourself. That's why we have all of our practice questions we release every single day. It's because we want students to be able to ask themselves questions and go through this. But that's a big deal. And this has been really scientifically rigorously studied. I remember there was an issue of Science. It was in November, I think, of 2019. It might be 18. My years have all smushed together. Where like there was a research article in Science, the journal article or the journal about just the testing effect, and they've been doing some more recent studies on it and some interesting stuff coming up. And so these are things that that you could be tested on. Like the MCAT will test you on spaced repetition, curve of forgetting. Like you need to know these things, but also I feel like the more you understand them, the easier it is to learn, because you can kind of put this into practice. So you should be quizzing yourself. You should be taking practice tests. That shouldn't be news, but just in case it is, you should be taking practice tests because that is way better than just studying.
Yeah. You took me back to first year of med school. Very mixed feelings about that year. But so I was in the program that I was in, in first year, we had a flipped classroom model. And so for people that are unfamiliar with the flipped classroom model, essentially you're expected to do most of the learning on your own. So the night before you go into class, you're going to study, and you're going to do a lot of studying, and then you'll take a mini quiz, right? And so you're getting that testing in. And then the next day you'll go into class, and it was also case-based learning. So we would work on cases that were related to what we learned, which was essentially one giant quiz, right? So the idea was combining studying, then a short quiz. The next day, right, when you will theoretically have forgotten a bit of it, which I can attest to, right? The more you have to study, the more likely you are to forget these smaller details. But then in class, you were working through these cases together. People might bring up things, which was that kind of spaced repetition. People were repeating, and we were all bringing different things to the table. We were working through questions and essentially a giant quiz together. Then in the class, we would review some of that material again with the instructor. Now, I hated I'm not doing myself any favors, but I hated this kind of flipped classroom case-based learning at first, because I was like, this is intense. But now that, I've thought more about it, and I've thought about how much I was able to retain, and how studying now for some of those things is easier, or when they came up, in second and third year. And I can really appreciate it. And so it's something that can feel really stressful to constantly have to go back and forth between studying and making diagrams and doing practice questions, but it really does pay off. And so it's important to recognize, yes, how something makes you feel, but also the efficiency of it and its effectiveness.
Yeah, that's something like obviously we're thinking about that a lot as we are creating material, trying to help students learn. And this is stuff like everything that we're talking about today are things that are like really on the forefront of like, okay, this is how to teach, this is how to learn. And you're right, some of those things don't seem very comfortable when you're doing it as a student, especially if you've never had instructors kind of do that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And it feels a little weird and uncomfortable, but it pays off when all of a sudden, like 3 years from now, somebody asks a question, you're like, oh, I know that. And you're like, why do I remember that thing from that one lecture, that one day? Like for some reason that has stuck with me. And so, yeah, it's a big deal.
Y'all, so I'm studying for step 1, and there is material that was that you guys are studying for on the MCAT. And so now I've seen the material, a lot more times, having helped people with the MCAT for a couple of years. And it's like this, it like feels some of these things, right? I haven't obviously I haven't taken the exam yet, so I don't know everything that's on it. But like the things that I've reviewed, I'm like, these come automatically because I've seen them so much over the years and at different spacings, right? When I was studying for the MCAT to some degree, then a pause, then in med school and whatnot. So it's helpful to see these things multiple times. It's also helpful how we try and remember things the first time. So think about the time that you got a new phone, right? Did you remember how many, let me count real quick how many numbers there are. So did you remember all 10 numbers, just like a string of them all at once? I don't have the ability to do that. And I suspect most of us didn't learn our phone numbers that way. We chunked them. So most people remember it by the first 3 numbers, right? So, thinking of an area code, I can think of, Chicago. I think Chicago is like 331.
Don't say an actual number because I feel like people are going to call it and be like, Azaii? Is Azaii here? Let's say like,
no.
555.
I was thinking of area codes, but we often remember the area code first, then the next 3 numbers, and then the next 4. When you see, a set of numbers and it makes you think of like, oh, this could be somebody's birthday, you can remember it as month, date, and year, right? Or if you're in other countries, you might do day, month, and then year. But we can essentially chunk the information that we're trying to remember into smaller bits that are easier to remember and that have more meaning to us. And so this idea of chunking can be really helpful when we're studying in general.
Yeah, this is actually like really powerful, right? Like to do an experiment, right? If I were to ask you guys to remember, I'm going to tell you 6 numbers, right? 1, 3, 4, 9, 8, 7, right? Like if we fast forward, 5-10 minutes from now, there's a good chance you don't remember those numbers, right? Now, would it be easier if you remembered 13, 49, 87, right? Like that's a whole lot easier to remember, even though it's the same numbers, right? But by grouping them, like, okay, 1 and 3, that's one group. 4, 9, that's one group. 8, 7, that's one group. All of a sudden, those 6 numbers become kind of 3 numbers. And like now you have to remember half as much, even though like technically it's the same series of numbers, but just presented in a different way. This is also why it's important to group things as you're studying overall. Like for example, the personality disorders. I know I already talked about that, but you have your cluster A, your cluster B, your cluster C. And so this also creates a really interesting thing. I wasn't planning on going into this, but this like semantic network where if you can remember one of them, it'll help you remember the other ones, right? So like in cluster B, we have antisocial, histrionic, narcissistic, and borderline personality disorder. And to be honest, I started that and I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, what are they again? I'm like, I remember antisocial. And like what happens is because I grouped them, as a result, remembering one helps you remember the other. Like you kind of like spreads and like, oh, this group, I've remembered all of those things. And so this idea of like chunking things is really big, right? It's a whole lot easier to remember big lists of information when you can group them and like remember the groups instead. And that's something that obviously you want to do when you're like learning and teaching. That's why like when I talk about KEQs in the course, I'm like, listen, all of these are the exact same. KAs, KBs, KDs, KSPs, KWs, like KFs, KCs, KRs. They're all the exact same thing. Here's the rules for KEQs. Now you can apply it to all these scenarios. When I was in undergrad, I feel like my teachers taught me to do a KSP and deal with KSP. And then like that was it. And then like next semester, someone would teach me about KAs of like acids and KBs of bases. And then like in biochem a year later, they're like, oh, here's a K of dissociation and KA of association. And I'm like trying to memorize these. And it just didn't click that like, hey, these are all the exact same thing. Like they're just being applied in different places. And so if you can do that sort of thing where it's like, oh, like instead of memorizing like 8 or 9 different rule sets, memorize one rule set that you can apply to all of them. And that's just way easier overall. I'm starting to feel kind of lazy. Like I want to remember one thing instead of 9 things like that. That's just easier to deal with.
Oh, 100%. And like, you talked about spreading activation. You are testable. Like that, not you. That is testable on the MCAT as well. Yes, we're gonna have practice questions on Phil and everything that Phil likes. I have to know,
They're
Phil,
adding a new
who have you
section,
been
the fifth
trying to
section.
diagnose? Because if you've been thinking about personality disorders this much lately, what celebrity are you trying to diagnose?
Everyone, all the time. It's also family and
Oh no.
well, family and friends. I'm like, oh, there's something going on there. Myself as well. I'm like, oh, I think I might have something going on here. Feeling a little dependent personality disorder today.
To be very clear, you guys, you should not go around trying to diagnose people, and especially not telling them that you think they have a diagnosis. Leave that to the mental health professionals and the psychiatrists.
I call it a game called stealth diagnosis, and the very important part of that is stealth. Like you do not go out and talk about it and share and like that sort of thing. But yeah, it's a fun game.
That might affect people's emotions too much.
Yeah. Ooh, I like your segue there. So going into emotions, this is also something that's kind of interesting. We, like our brains, some things are more important to us than others. Let me kind of like step back, right? Like if I tell you that sorghum is an ingredient in hardtack, I don't even know if that's true. But like nobody cares about this, right? But if I say like cyanide could kill you, right? Like all of a sudden that's way more interesting, right? Because there's some kind of emotional like things to this, like it's relevant to you. Mm-hmm. And there are there's this thing called flashbulb memories. And it turns out whenever you are in a very emotional setting, or like something that could be very traumatic, right? Your memory like becomes way better, right? And so flashbulb memories, we call them this because it's like you took a picture with a camera, right? And like it's perfect detail and everything's really obvious. And this can be useful. It can be problematic because a lot of times emotions are not like there's negative scenarios, like really traumatic things, like when like my parents died, or when I was in a car wreck, or when my friend was like their appendix burst and they started bleeding out of their nose all at the same time. It's like, oh my gosh, this is really traumatic. Or somebody got shot, right? Those are things that are really like traumatic experiences, but they're often really tied to experience or to memory and emotion. And so you remember those things really well. And that's actually one of the ideas behind PTSD. People who have PTSD, their memory is so sharp of these things. Every time they remember, it's like they're reliving it because it's like so vivid and present. It feels like they're there because it's so crystal clear in their head. And this can lead to, obviously, like all sorts of issues with post-traumatic stress disorder. But you can also kind of take advantage of this. I remember when I got my first acceptance to med school, that moment is crystallized in my head, right? Like that's a positive emotion. And that still that thing is like crystallized in my head. I remember what I was wearing. I remember I like opened the letter as I was sitting in my car at the mailbox, and I'm like, I just couldn't wait to even like get out of the car and go inside. And so I also lived in the country where the mailbox you had to drive to get to the mailbox. But that sort of thing can be really useful. And you can also hijack this. I know I've talked about this in the classroom. I think I may have talked about it in the podcast. But I had a scenario where I had a friend of mine, Brian, who is a physician, and he's a great physician. We went to med school together, and we were in pharmacology. And I was just like, Brian, how do you remember all of these side effects for all these drugs? Because he remembered all of them all the time. And I'm just like, Brian, how do you know that? And he would tell me, he's like, well, I'll make up stories. I'll say that like I had a patient I gave this drug to, and I forgot to check their potassium, and so they died. And I'm like, whoa, that's like really dark. He's like, yeah, but I'm going to remember that forever. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I realize it now. Like, he's taking advantage of flashable memories. Like, he is taking an idea and tying it to a memory. And by making that association, it becomes something that's very vivid, very strong, and just kind of held in their brain. And so this is something you want to kind of take advantage of in a healthy way, for sure. But just understand that emotions can charge a memory and like make it stick a little bit more. I think honestly, that's one of the reasons we don't remember stuff as we're studying that much, because it's boring most of the time. And you're like, I would rather be something else. There's nothing interesting. I'm just reading this and like copying down definitions. You remember stuff much better if there's an experience tied to it. And so by tying something to an experience or an emotion, even if it's not a real event, it can help that memory stick better overall.
Yeah. I want to pause really quickly and like acknowledge and make space that, you know, we brought up some heavy topics just now.
Yeah.
And so if you need to step away for a moment, pause, come back later, it's okay to do so. And
probably should have done that at the beginning. I should have thought about that a little bit more.
But make some space, right? Because there will be things that, you know, even in the future when you're working with patients can be very activating. So learning to care for yourself during that process is important. But yeah, like going back to what we were talking about, the power of emotions is huge. And like there are patients that I will never forget their stories because of how like the emotions that I experienced, right? When, you know, seeing some of my patients in the emergency room or when they were admitted, right? When they were struggling and like, I was sitting there, okay, what can I possibly do? Like, what information do they need from me that I should be able to tell them? Those are the kinds of things that, you know, are going to be easier to remember 110%. And like you said, I like this idea of not necessarily having to wait until we have patients that we're seeing in front of us with these conditions, but just making up the stories. I think you have talked about it before. But yeah, there's a lot that we can do that can help us remember things, right? And in addition to kind of honing in on emotions that we might be able to produce and maybe at a lower level, the first time you see something is also really powerful, right? And if let's say that you have a list of medications with a bunch of side effects, right? If you sit down and list every single side effect, it's going to be tough to remember them. But if I ask you really quickly, you just sat down and, you know, let's say that the side effects were, I'm going to make these up on the spot, itching, flushing face, muscle weakness, nausea, and vomiting, right? You're probably going to remember the itching because that was the first thing that I mentioned. And you're also probably going to remember the vomiting. But what was number 3, right? It's a little harder to remember. I gave a shorter list.
That's weird. I actually don't remember it. Like as you
It
went through that, I'm like, yeah,
weakness.
I know the itching, the muscle weakness was one, vomiting. I don't remember the other one.
Yeah. Itching, flushing of the face.
The second one. Yeah, there we go.
Muscle weakness was 3, nausea, and then vomiting was the last one. But it's very, I mean, that perfectly shows, right, how that first thing that we see, that primacy effect, and that most recent thing we saw, that last thing, the recency effect, can have a really big role in how we're studying. And so one thing that just kind of thought experiment in this moment is maybe we flip the order of things, right? Because now if I started with muscle weakness and I ended with flushing of the face, I'll remember those 2. And maybe I can keep kind of swapping them. This is just a thought experiment as this came into my head as we're having this conversation. So take it with a grain of salt. But that might be a way to capitalize on the primacy and the recency effect.
Yeah, I'm surprised that you mentioned that, Azaii, because that's something that we specifically were thinking about with the new product thing that we're launching. That's something I like factored into this. I feel like we should just talk about this. Like everything that we've talked about now, the Ebbinghaus curve of forgetting, spaced repetition, chunking, testing effect, like emotionally charging stuff, and then the primacy and recency effect. All of those are things that we thought about when we launched our new flashcard app. And so we're starting flashcards It's essentially, it's very similar to Anki. And you can actually upload Anki decks into the system, or you will be very shortly. But Jack Westin we have our own flashcard system that we're creating. And this flashcard system works with Ebbinghaus's curve of forgetting. So as you go through, you can say how confident you are with each of these different topics. And if you're even if you say, I'm pretty confident with this, you're going to see that topic again, and it's going to pop up, but it's going to pop up less often. And so the more you see something and the more confident you say you are with this, you're going to see that less often, but you will see it again. And it kind of builds upon itself. Obviously this has to do with the testing effect, right? Because you're being shown something and asked hey, what is this thing again? And you're quizzing yourself, which this is a better way of learning and retaining information long term. Also chunking. So depending on how you build your cards and how the cards are built, you can group information in those cards, and you can also put in a story or an emotionally charged or a funny anecdote or something to help you kind of remember these. So these flashcards can take advantage of this chunking, but also the emotional charging. And then the flashcards are constantly reordered. And so the first flashcard you see is never going to be the same one. And so we're changing the order all the time. So if you were to remember just the first ones, then you will the first ones are going to be different every time. And so eventually this will help you kind of put this together. And so I feel I should talk a little bit more about this. Overall, the idea is so right now we have just some of the most commonly used decks used for MCAT prep. I will say, so these are decks that we have not made. These are decks that have been made by the MCAT learning community. And so even if we look at just the most common ones, I will say, Azaii and I were looking through this one earlier, and I'm I found an error. I kind of don't like that, and I'm annoyed by it. But I think we're going to try to see if we can tweak and change that one. So these will be getting better over time. Right now, you can use decks that have already been made. In the future, you'll be able to make your own decks and also upload decks from other sources. And so you can kind of create this and grow and make your own. And I think that this can be a really useful thing for students to basically, because of all the things that we talked about today, this flashcard stuff takes advantage of that. All those different techniques all kind of being smashed into one experience for a student, where you can kind of go through this and plow through a whole bunch of content.
Yeah. And if you're anything like me, you've probably thought at times oh, I'm not a flashcard person. I just don't learn that way. And for a long time, that was the case for me. But I've realized that I wasn't efficient at how I use the flashcards. So I'm someone that loves drawing things by hand and writing things by hand. Trying to make flashcards by hand these days, not super helpful, right? Which is why there's this, electronic version. I also found honestly, the apps out there are really overwhelming. I have, so many friends that have used Anki, and I'm just I don't even know where to start. Right. And so, the idea is that this user interface is generally going to be easier. And it makes life easier if you have a concrete way that you're doing spaced repetition. And so giving it a try, because I've recently, just the sheer amount of learning that I've had to do, I have incorporated a bit more flashcards into my studying. Now I want to be very clear, because this is something that I've seen happen even with med students. It's using flashcards to replace actual studying. And that kind of first attempt at learning. These flashcards and the ability to use this on the Jack Westin website will not replace the course. They'll not replace your study. They won't replace your studying. They won't replace the content that you should still
exams.
Yeah, the practice exams. They are supplemental. It's a really strong supplemental tool, but make sure that you don't get to the point where the only thing you do is flashcards. And I think that's important to say, because I've definitely seen people do that. And then after they take their, exam over a much shorter period of time, let me clarify, they don't remember. And this is the kind of information I hope that we've shown you want to remember, because you will see this material again, as you continue your journey to become a physician.
Yeah, I like that. I know, Azaii, you mentioned, I think outside of this episode, you mentioned that you were seeing questions about enzymatics as you're like doing your prep for step ones. And so just this idea of like, oh, if we can study stuff now so that it will stick with us better, that's awesome, right? Because that'll like save you time and make things easier down the road. I definitely want to agree with what you said. I think it's tricky because different students have different weaknesses. And so somebody who is just really weak in content, flashcards will help with that. If your weak areas are like strategy, data interpretation, or endurance, right? Like all of a sudden, like during the actual exam, like flashcards aren't going to help that as much. And so I've seen students that flashcards have really boosted their score like a lot, like kind of jumping up multiple points over the course of like a week or two. And I've also seen students that have put in a lot of time in flashcards and it hasn't done anything, because I think that's all they did was just the flashcard stuff. And so this is absolutely meant to be a supplemental thing, but I'm pretty excited about it and it will be pretty useful. I will say right now, it only works in our browser. But we are working on getting this in an app on your phone, so you can like go through like flashcards as you're like walking to class, or as you're like sitting, at the doctor's office waiting for something, or if you have a break, you can just kind of like churn through, 10, 15 flashcards real quick. And so I'm super excited about this. And this is something that literally we've been working on for over a year behind the scenes, trying to get all the tech going in, trying to get the spaced repetition right so that you are seeing cards exactly as often as you need to maximize the rate of learning. And minimize the amount of time you have to put in. And so there's a whole lot of work that's kind of gone in behind the scenes, but it should be very user-friendly. As you mentioned, Azaii, I feel like Anki is kind of like, it's not very user-friendly. It's kind of hard to use. Yeah, it's like, I feel like I needed a like computer engineering degree to be able to like figure out how to actually do this stuff. And I'm sure everyone out there is like, oh, it's actually pretty easy. And I'm like, oh, I'm just showing how old I am. I've passed that age where I'm like, technology, I don't like it. It's too complex. Back in my day, we just had a calculator. But this has I think that this will be really useful and really easy for students to just kind of jump in, do some practice, learn some content, and do it in a way that's actually kind of fun and easy, and will have you remembering stuff for longer.
Yeah, go ahead, go check out the new flashcard app on our website and let us know what you think.